the smile that hid the darkness. If you think you know what evil looks like, think again. Subscribe, comment, and keep watching, because this story isn't for the faint of heart. Chicago, 1978. The bitter cold of December hung over the city, turning every breath into fog. Detective David Hackmeister stood outside 8213 West Summerdale Avenue, a modest ranch-style home with Christmas lights still clinging to the roof. The house looked ordinary, almost cheerful, but the air around it felt wrong. The front lawn was frozen solid, yet something beneath it reeked of decay. Earlier that week, a teenage boy named Robert Piest had vanished after telling his mother he was going to talk to a contractor about a part-time job. The man's name? John Wayne Gacy. To neighbors, Gacy was the embodiment of kindness. A contractor, community volunteer, and part-time clown who entertained at hospitals and children's events. He called himself Pogo the Clown, and people loved him for it. But the detectives had just discovered a trail of disappearances, all leading back to this same smiling man. Now, as police circled his property, Gacy stood on the porch, smiling politely. "You've got it wrong," he told them. "I've done nothing." His words were calm, but his eyes, they never matched the smile. The investigation began weeks earlier. When Piest disappeared, his co-workers said Gacy had been the last person to see him alive. Detectives visited Gacy's house to ask questions. He invited them in, friendly, confident, almost rehearsed. Inside, the smell of damp earth mixed with something faintly metallic. He claimed it was a plumbing issue. They left that first day with a strange feeling. Something didn't add up. Gacy's charm was too perfect, his hospitality too forced. When the team dug deeper, they found a disturbing pattern. Dozens of young men had gone missing across Chicago between 1972 and 1978, all last seen near bus stations, convenience stores, or job sites. Many had been runaways, drifters, or boys looking for work. Few had families who pushed hard enough for answers. One detective said, "It's like they vanished into thin air." But Gacy was always there, in photos from community events, at charity fundraisers, even shaking hands with local politicians. The city saw him as a model citizen. The police were starting to see something else entirely. A few days later, officers obtained a search warrant for Gacy's home. It was supposed to be routine, just a chance to look for the missing boy's belongings. They entered the basement first. It was dimly lit, cluttered with tools, old paint cans, and construction materials. But beneath that, something stronger than mildew filled the air. As they inspected the crawl space, one officer gagged. "Something's dead down there," he muttered. Gacy quickly appeared behind them. "It's just old plumbing," he said again, smiling too easily. But the smell didn't lie. Detectives stepped outside to regroup. Snow had begun to fall, coating the street in a quiet layer of white. One of the officers leaned against the car, trying to shake the image of that basement from his mind. Gacy approached them again, still calm. "You guys want coffee? I can make some." It was the kind of casual offer that felt wrong, too normal for what they were feeling. They declined. That night, while Gacy slept soundly in his home, the detectives worked late. They pulled phone records, cross-checked missing persons cases, and requested a warrant for soil testing. The more they looked, the more the puzzle pieces aligned. Gacy's company had hired several of the missing boys. The evidence wasn't enough yet, but instinct screamed that time was running out. The following day, the team decided to tail Gacy. Surveillance officers followed his car through the snowy streets of Chicago. What they saw was unsettling. He drove aimlessly, visiting diners, bars, even stopping at random parking lots. He acted as though he knew he was being watched, sometimes staring directly at the unmarked police car trailing behind him. Late one night, He approached one of the officers outside a restaurant. "You guys following me again?" he said with a grin. "If I was guilty of something, don't you think you'd have proof by now?" It was mockery, calm, deliberate, and fearless. By mid-December, the detectives were desperate for a break. Then came the tip that changed everything. A pharmacy employee recalled Gacy's visit the night Piest disappeared. He'd mentioned wanting to hire the boy for a construction job. That was enough for a second search warrant. On December 21st, police returned to the house. Gacy wasn't there. The temperature had dropped below freezing. Officers stepped into the basement again. The air was heavy, thick with that same smell. They found a small trapdoor leading to the crawl space. As one officer pried it open, the stench hit harder this time, unmistakable and suffocating. He shone his flashlight into the darkness and saw something pale protruding from the dirt. At first, it looked like a broken pipe. Then the light shifted. It wasn't a pipe. It was a human bone. The officer stumbled back, eyes wide. "We've got a body!" Within minutes, the team secured the house. Word spread fast. First across the department, then across the city. What they uncovered beneath Gacy's home would shock the world. When Gacy returned home later that night, still confident, he was met with flashing lights and a swarm of officers. His smile faltered for the first time. Detective Hatchmeister looked at him squarely. "John, we found something under your house." For a moment, the air went still. Then Gacy's expression changed. Not fear, but something else. A cruel, resignation. He simply said, "I think it's time I tell you everything." Officers descended into the crawl space with shovels, lights, and evidence bags. The ground was packed with clay, cold and damp. As they dug, they found the first set of remains, then another, and another, each one carefully buried beneath the foundation. The crawl space wasn't just a hiding place. It was a graveyard. Neighbors gathered outside in disbelief as the police brought out body after body. News vans lined the street. The man they'd invited to children's parties, the cheerful neighbor who waved from his driveway, had been living above horrors no one dared imagine. Inside the station, Gacy sat quietly. No more smiles. He began talking, calmly, almost conversationally. He spoke about his work, his parties, his life. And then, piece by piece, he described what he'd done. Detectives sat frozen, realizing they were listening to one of the most chilling confessions in U.S. history. By the time dawn broke, the truth was undeniable. Beneath that quiet suburban home, police had found multiple bodies, and Gacy hinted there were more. But what he said next left investigators speechless. "I didn't bury them all myself," he murmured. "Some of them helped me. The Mask of Pogo." December 22nd, 1978. The crawlspace under 8213 West Summerdale was no longer just a basement. It was a crime scene unlike anything Chicago had ever seen. The bitter cold didn't stop the detectives or the crime lab technicians. They worked for hours, digging through the frozen clay, uncovering body after body. The house that once smelled faintly of mildew now carried the unbearable weight of truth. By dawn, they had recovered 8 sets of remains. The officers stopped keeping count aloud. The number was too staggering. Some of them, hardened by years of service, had to step outside for air. Meanwhile, John Wayne Gacy sat in an interrogation room at the Des Plaines Police Department, calm as ever. He wasn't handcuffed, wasn't shouting. He was talking, even joking, as if this were just another day. He smiled at the detectives and said, "I guess I've got a lot to explain." Detective Hatchmeister watched him from across the table, struggling to process the composure in front of him. Gacy didn't fit the picture of a killer. He was articulate, polite, and disturbingly normal. "I did what I had to do," Gacy said at one point, his voice steady. They weren't angels. Most of them were just troublemakers, runaways. No one cared about them until now. The words landed like stones. He went on to describe his method, how he'd lure young men and boys to his home under the pretense of offering them work or money. He'd charm them, make them feel safe. Then, when the door closed, everything changed. But what horrified detectives wasn't just what he'd done. It was how casually he spoke about it. There was no guilt, no emotion, just a man recounting events like he was talking about the weather. The news spread like wildfire. By Christmas Eve, every major network in the country was covering the story. The headlines called him the Killer Clown. Photos of Gacy in his clown costume, red wig, painted smile, and wide blue eyes flashed across television screens nationwide. Parents who had once laughed at the sight of Pogo the Clown now couldn't look at the image without shivering. Neighbors were interviewed on live TV, their voices trembling. "He was always so friendly," one woman said. "He fixed our fence, helped with parties. He even gave toys to the kids." But behind that smile had been something far darker. A man who used kindness as camouflage. The search at Gacy's home continued for days. Every new discovery seemed to blur the line between nightmare and reality. Investigators found wallets, watches, and pieces of clothing belonging to missing boys. One officer described it later. "We stopped thinking of it as evidence. We started thinking of them as names, people who had families." By December 29th, the count had reached 24. The crawl space was full. Then someone found a trench beneath the garage. Inside were more remains. Detectives realized what this meant. When the ground under the house became too crowded, Gacy kept going. He found new places to hide what he'd done. The interrogation deepened. When asked how he managed to live above all that, Gacy simply shrugged. "You get used to it," he said quietly. Then, as if flipping a switch, he added, "But it wasn't just me. Some of them helped." The room fell silent. "Helped?" the detective asked. "You mean you had an accomplice?" Gacy leaned back in his chair, eyes flickering with something unreadable. "You'll never prove that, but I didn't do everything alone." That statement would haunt investigators for decades. The suggestion that someone else might have helped him, or at least known. When the police raided Gacy's business office, they found stacks of contracts, employment forms, and records of boys who had worked for him, eye of whom had disappeared. Some of the names matched the victims they'd already found. But there was another twist. Gacy had met some of his victims through charity events, political fundraisers, and community service groups. He had shaken hands with politicians, even photographed himself with local officials. The man behind the mask of Pogo the Clown had been hiding in plain sight, protected by his own reputation. The following month, investigators began piecing together the timeline of the murders. Between 1972 and 1978, Gacy's pattern had remained eerily consistent. He targeted vulnerable young men, those looking for work, running from home, or simply trusting the wrong person. Detectives noticed something chilling. Many of the victims had been reported missing, but their cases never connected. Different police departments handled different reports, and the lines of communication failed. If those missing persons had been linked earlier, Gacy might have been caught years sooner. The system had gaps, and he exploited every single one. In early January 1979, Gacy was formally charged with multiple counts of murder. Reporters surrounded the courthouse, snapping photos as he was led inside. He wore a simple sweater, no clown makeup, no mask. Just an ordinary man who had fooled an entire city. During pre-trial interviews, Gacy began to paint himself as a victim of split personalities. He referred to his alter ego as Jack Hanley, claiming that Jack was responsible for the killings, not him. To the media, It was another bizarre twist in an already unbelievable story. To investigators, it was strategy. Another manipulation from a man who had spent his life deceiving everyone around him. The most haunting part came when the forensic team identified the victims. Parents who had waited years for answers received the calls they had both dreaded and prayed for. Some of them traveled from other states, standing quietly outside the house where their sons had been found. One mother told reporters, "He made them disappear, but they're not forgotten anymore." The recovery process took months. In total, 29 bodies were found beneath or around Gacy's property. 4 more were discovered in nearby rivers. Each one told the same story, of trust betrayed, of a city that never saw the monster living among them. As winter turned to spring, the crawlspace was empty, the house abandoned. But what lingered was the question no one could answer. How could a man who smiled for cameras, painted faces for children, and volunteered at charity events commit such horrors unnoticed? Detective Hochmeister returned to the house one last time before it was demolished. The walls were bare, the floors stripped. The silence inside felt endless. He stood in the middle of the empty room and whispered, "You can bury the house, but not the truth." Outside, reporters shouted questions. Some wanted to know how Gacy could hide this for so long. Others wanted to know if the police believed his claim that he hadn't acted alone. But Hochmeister said nothing. He just stared at the yard, the same ground where everything had been buried, and walked away. Because he knew the real trial hadn't started yet. And once it did, the world would see John Wayne Gacy not as the clown, not as the contractor, but as something far worse. A man who turned ordinary life into a mask for madness. But what he said in court, and how he said it, would leave even the jury in stunned silence. The trial of the killer clown. February 6, 1980. Cook County Courthouse, Chicago. The courtroom was packed before sunrise. Reporters filled every seat. Cameras lined the hallways. And outside, people gathered behind police barricades, hoping for a glimpse of the man the world now called the killer clown. John Wayne Gacy entered wearing a gray suit and a faint smile, as though he were attending a business meeting rather than standing trial for 33 counts of murder. He nodded at the press, at the jury, even at the prosecutor, the same way he used to greet neighbors at his front lawn. But this time, the smile didn't disguise who he was. Everyone in that room knew. The prosecution opened with a statement that silenced the entire room. Underneath the floorboards of his home, John Wayne Gacy buried the innocence of an entire city. For weeks, jurors listened to evidence that painted a portrait of 2 lives. By day, Gacy was a contractor, volunteer, and clown who performed at children's hospitals. By night, he was something entirely different, a predator who used trust as a weapon. Detectives, psychologists, and forensic experts took the stand. They described the crawlspace, the remains, the pattern of disappearances. Each detail hit harder than the last. The prosecution showed maps of where each victim had been found, dots spreading beneath that single suburban house like roots of evil. When crime scene photographs were displayed, the courtroom went silent. Even the jurors looked down. Gacy watched calmly, occasionally leaning toward his attorney to whisper something no one else could hear. Then came the defense, and with it, one final act in Gacy's performance. His lawyers claimed he suffered from multiple personality disorder. They argued that John Gacy was the public persona, friendly, reliable, hardworking, but his darker side, Jack Hanley, had omitted the crimes without Gacy's awareness. They called psychiatrists who described dissociative states, lost time, and identity fragmentation. One even suggested that his time as a clown symbolized the split between humor and horror. The courtroom buzzed with speculation. Was this genuine madness or manipulation from a man who had deceived everyone for years? The prosecution countered hard. They presented receipts, written statements, and meticulous records kept by Gacy himself. Proof that he had planned, covered up, and even joked about the murders. This wasn't the mind of someone lost in delusion. This was organization. Control. One prosecutor said bluntly, "John Wayne Gacy isn't insane. He's calculating." But the most haunting testimony didn't come from doctors or detectives. It came from the families. Parents took the stand, their voices shaking as they spoke about the years of not knowing. The birthdays missed, the unanswered phone calls, the sleepless nights waiting for sons who would never come home. One mother looked directly at Gacy as she spoke. "You didn't just kill them," she said quietly. "You erased them." For the first time during the entire trial, Gacy looked away. The media turned the case into a national obsession. Talk shows debated whether monsters were born or made. Psychologists analyzed every facial expression Gacy made in court. And yet, beneath all the noise, one truth remained. No one could understand how he'd lived so normally, so publicly, while hiding such horror beneath his feet. The prosecution rested with a final piece of evidence, a statement Gacy had made to detectives the night of his arrest. "I'm not the only one. There are others like me." It wasn't just a confession, it was a warning. After 5 weeks of testimony, the case went to the jury. The deliberation took less than 2 hours. When they returned, the Villahad's verdict was unanimous. Guilty on all counts. Gacy showed no emotion as the sentence was read. Death by lethal injection. Reporters scrambled to capture the moment, flashbulbs lighting up his blank expression. As he was escorted out of the courtroom, a journalist shouted, "Do you have anything to say?" Gacy smirked and said, "You can kiss my..." The rest was drowned out by the noise of the crowd. Over the years that followed, Gacy's name became synonymous with fear. From prison, he gave interviews, painted portraits of clowns, and continued to insist that he was innocent, or at least misunderstood. He even mailed paintings to reporters and lawyers, signing them with a smiley face. People were horrified, not by the art, but by the idea that the same hands that buried lives were now creating cheerful faces. Psychologists studied him. Criminologists wrote books. Filmmakers turned his story into documentaries and dramas. Yet, through all of it, Gacy seemed almost proud of the attention. When one interviewer asked why he thought people were still fascinated by him, he said, "Because I'm the last person they'd expect. That's what scares them." In 1994, 16 years after his conviction, John Wayne Gacy's time finally ran out. At Stateville Correctional Center, he was led into the execution chamber. Reporters waited outside the prison walls, the sky gray and cold. Inside, witnesses described him as calm, even cheerful. His last meal was fried chicken, fries, and strawberries, his favorite foods from the business he once ran. When asked if he had any final words, he smiled slightly and said something short and defiant. At 12:58 a.m., it was over. Outside, hundreds of people gathered. Some carried signs, others simply stood in silence. For many families, it was closure, not happiness, but the end of a shadow that had loomed for decades. But the story didn't end there. In the years after Gacy's death, investigators continued to identify his unknown victims using DNA analysis. So, families finally received answers after more than 30 years. Others still wait. Even today, several of Gacy's victims remain unnamed. Reminders of how many lives were quietly erased, how easily one man hid behind a smile. The house on West Summerdale Avenue was demolished in 1979. A new home stands there now. Ordinary, clean, peaceful. But for the people of Chicago, the ground beneath it still holds echoes of the past. Detective Hackmeister, long retired, once visited the site years later. He stood on the quiet street and whispered, "You can change the house, but you can't change the story. John Wayne Gacy's legacy is more than the number of lives he took. It's the terrifying truth that monsters don't always lurk in the shadows. Sometimes, they wave from across the street, wearing painted smiles and shaking hands. And for every person who watched that trial, the lesson was carved in memory. Evil isn't always obvious. It's often polite, friendly, and unremarkable. Until the mask slips. They called him Pogo the Clown. But behind the laughter was a silence that haunted Chicago. And it still does. If you think this story was dark, you're not ready for the next one. Hit subscribe, because the truth only gets stranger.